Welcome to Enigma of the Unknown, where we uncover the most chilling and mysterious tales from across the globe. Tonight, we venture deep into the haunting forests of New Mexico, a land of breathtaking beauty and ancient legends. From the whispers of Carson Forest to the terrifying Skinwalker in Navajo lands, these 6 camping stories will send shivers down your spine. Turn off the lights, settle in, and prepare for a journey into the dark heart of New Mexico's wilderness. Story number 1. Whispers from Valle Vidal. I've always been a lover of the wilderness, a city boy with a soul that craved the solitude and raw beauty of untouched nature. So when my old college friend, Mark, suggested a camping trip to Valle Vidal in northern New Mexico, I didn't hesitate. Valle Vidal, Valley of Life. They called it a pristine swath of forest nestled within the Carson National Forest. I'd heard whispers about the place, stories spun by locals about mysterious calls from the swamps that lured people into the depths of the woods. But I wasn't one to be swayed by folklore. "Come on, Alex," Mark had said over the phone. "One last adventure before life ties us down." He was referring to my impending marriage and his new job overseas. It seemed the perfect farewell to our carefree days. We set out on a crisp autumn morning, the sun casting golden hues over the landscape. The drive was long but filled with laughter and reminiscing. Along for the journey were Lisa and Sarah, friends from college who shared our thirst for adventure. As we neared Valle Vidal, the road narrowed, and civilization faded behind us. Towering pines loomed overhead, their branches knitting together to blot out the sun, casting the forest floor in a perpetual twilight. At the ranger station, an old man with weathered skin and piercing blue eyes warned us. "Stick to the trails," he said, his voice gravelly. "And if you hear someone calling your name, ignore it." Mark chuckled nervously. "Why's that?" The ranger fixed him with a hard stare. "Just trust me. Valle Vidal has a way of keeping those who stray." We brushed off his warning as mere superstition, a tale told to spook tourists. Our campsite was a meadow encircled by dense woods, a tranquil spot beside a murmuring brook. We pitched our tents, gathered firewood, and settled in as the sun dipped below the tree line. As night fell, we sat around the crackling fire, the stars emerging in the velvet sky above. "Did you guys hear the ranger earlier?" Lisa asked, her eyes reflecting the flames. "About ignoring voices that call your name? Just trying to scare us," Mark said, poking at the fire with a stick. Sarah shivered. "Well, it's working. This place does feel different. That's the beauty of it," I replied, untouched, unspoiled. We turned in around midnight. The others drifted off quickly, but sleep eluded me. The forest was alive with sounds, the hoot of an owl, the rustling of leaves, the distant cry of some nocturnal creature. Just as I felt myself finally slipping into sleep, I heard it. "Alex!" A soft whisper, barely audible over the sighing of the wind. I sat up, listening intently. "Alex!" It was clearer this time, a woman's voice, familiar yet unplaceable. I unzipped the tent and peered into the darkness. The fire had died down to embers, casting feeble light. Shadows danced at the edges of the clearing. "Hello!" I called out softly. No response. I reasoned it away, the wind. A half-dream. I lay back down, pulling the sleeping bag tighter. Minutes later, the voice came again, more insistent. "Alex, come here." A chill crept over me. I glanced at Mark's tent. No movement. I didn't want to wake the others over what was surely my imagination. I decided to ignore it. Morning came, and with it, the warmth of the sun chased away the night's unease. Over breakfast, I considered mentioning the voice but didn't want to sound foolish. We spent the day hiking, the forest revealing its wonders with each step. Fields of wildflowers, herds of elk grazing in distant meadows, the scent of pine and earth rich in the air. As dusk approached, we returned to camp, weary but content. Mark suggested we gather more firewood before dark. Lisa and Sarah opted to stay behind to prepare dinner. Mark and I ventured deeper into the woods, the shadows lengthening around us. Beautiful, isn't it? He remarked, hefting a fallen branch. Yeah, I agreed, though I can see how someone might get lost out here. He grinned. Good thing we've got our trusty map and compass. We ventured further, the conversation flowing easily. Suddenly, Mark paused. Did you hear that? He asked. Hear what? Someone calling my name. A prickling sensation crept up my spine. Probably the girls, I said, though we were too far for them to be heard. He shrugged, but his eyes scanned the trees. We continued, but the mood had shifted. The forest felt oppressive, the silence heavy. Mark, a voice whispered. He stopped again. There it is again. This time, I heard it too, a faint call, barely discernible. Maybe we should head back, I suggested. He nodded, and we turned to retrace our steps. But the path we'd taken seemed unfamiliar. Did we come this way? Mark asked, uncertainty tinged with fear. I thought so, I replied, though doubt gnawed at me. Mark, Alex. The voice called, echoing among the trees. Who's there? Mark shouted. Silence. We quickened our pace, the woods growing darker. Shadows stretched like grasping fingers, and every rustle made us jump. After what felt like hours, we stumbled into the clearing of our campsite. Relief washed over me, but it was short-lived. Lisa and Sarah were nowhere to be seen. Lisa? Sarah? Mark called out. No response. The campfire was unlit, the tents untouched. They must have gone looking for us, I said, trying to sound convincing. Split up, Mark suggested. I hesitated. The idea of being alone didn't sit well. All right, I agreed reluctantly, but stay within shouting distance. We set off in opposite directions around the perimeter of the campsite. Lisa, Sarah, I called out, my voice swallowed by the dense forest. Alex, the whisper came again, closer now. I spun around, the hairs on my neck standing on end. Who's there? I demanded. From the corner of my eye, I caught a glimpse of movement, a figure darting between the trees. Lisa, I chased after it, branches whipping against my face. I emerged into a small clearing. Standing in the center was a woman, her back to me. Her long dark hair cascaded over a pale dress that fluttered in a non-existent breeze. Excuse me, are you lost? I asked, approaching cautiously. She turned slowly. Her eyes were hollow, her skin ashen. A twisted smile spread across her face. Come with me, she whispered. Every instinct screamed at me to run, but my feet felt rooted to the spot. Who are you? I managed to choke out. She extended a hand toward me. We've been waiting for you. A cacophony of voices erupted from the woods. Mark, Lisa, Sarah, all calling my name in distress. Help us, Alex. I tore my gaze from the woman and bolted back toward the campsite. Alex. Mark's voice was desperate. I followed the sound, adrenaline surging, bursting into the clearing. I found Mark alone, his face etched with terror. Lisa and Sarah, they're gone, he cried. We have to find them, I said, though dread coiled in my stomach. Together, we plunged back into the forest, calling their names. Over here, Sarah's voice echoed. We followed, the trees closing in around us. Help me, Lisa's voice now, tinged with fear. We stumbled upon a swampy area, the ground soggy beneath our feet. This can't be right, Mark muttered. There shouldn't be a swamp here. Mark, Alex. The whispers encircled us. The fog rolled in, thick and suffocating. Stay close, I urged. Figures moved within the mist, shadows without substance. Join us. They beckoned. I grabbed Mark's arm. We need to get out of here, but the swamp seemed to stretch endlessly in all directions. Alex, I'm scared. He admitted, his bravado gone. Me too, I confessed. A child's laughter rang out, eerie and disjointed. Do you hear that? Mark whispered. Before I could answer, the ground gave way beneath him. Mark! I shouted as he sank into the murky water. I lunged forward, grabbing his hand. The cold seeped into my bones as I struggled to pull him out. Something's pulling me, he screamed. I braced myself, heaving with all my strength. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw them, the pale figures of children, their eyes black voids, their hands grasping at Mark's legs. Let him go, I yelled. They stared at me, emotionless. With a final tug, I freed Mark, and we tumbled backward onto solid ground. Run, I urged. We fled blindly, the whispers morphing into wails of anger. Branches tore at our clothes, the fog thinning as we crashed through the underbrush. Suddenly, we broke through the tree line, collapsing onto the path near our campsite. Gasping for breath, we looked back. The forest was still, the swamp gone. What the hell was that? Mark panted. I don't know, I admitted, but we need to find the girls. A faint humming drew our attention. Following the sound, we found Lisa and Sarah sitting by the extinguished fire, their expressions blank. Where have you been? I demanded. They looked up slowly, their eyes devoid of recognition. Come sit with us, Lisa said in a monotone voice. Are you okay? Mark asked, approaching them. Before he could reach them, they stood in unison and began walking toward the forest. Wait, I shouted. They ignored us, disappearing into the shadows. We chased after them, but the forest seemed to warp and twist, paths leading nowhere. Stop, Mark cried out, but they were gone, exhausted and defeated. We returned to the campsite. Dawn was breaking, the first rays of sunlight piercing through the canopy. We have to get help, I said. We packed up hastily and made our way back to the ranger station. The old ranger listened as we recounted our ordeal, his face grim. I warned you, he said softly. Please, our friends are missing. Mark pleaded. He nodded. People have been disappearing in Valle Vidal for years. The forest, it lures them. What can we do? I asked desperately. He sighed. Sometimes they return on their own. Other times, they become part of the forest. That's not acceptable, Mark snapped. We have to find them. The ranger met his gaze. I can gather a search party, but you must understand, the woods don't like to give back what they've taken. We spent the next 3 days searching, but there was no trace of Lisa and Sarah. The forest remained silent, indifferent to our desperation. On the fourth day, authorities advised us to return home, promising to continue the search. Mark and I parted ways, burdened by guilt and loss. Months passed, and the nightmares began. Whispers in the night, shadows at the edge of my vision, a constant feeling of being watched. One evening, I received a call from Mark. I saw her, he whispered. Who? Lisa. She was standing outside my window. That's impossible, I said, though my skin prickled. She called my name, just like before. Fear tightened its grip. You need to ignore it. I can't, he replied. I have to go back. Don't, I warned. It's what they want. He hung up, and I knew I'd lost him. Mark's body was found near Valle Vidal a week later. Cause of death, exposure. But I knew better. Now, I live with the weight of 2 losses and the knowledge that the forest still calls to me. Some nights, when sleep eludes me, I hear them whispering my name, beckoning me back. I resist, but the pull grows stronger. If you ever find yourself in Valle Vidal, heed my warning. Do not follow the voices. Stay on the path. And if the forest calls your name, run. Because some places are alive with ancient hunger. And once they've touched you, they never let go. Story number 2. The Weeping Woman of Bluewater Lake. I've always been drawn to the quiet solitude of nature. As a freelance writer, the isolation helps me think, clears the clutter from my mind. So when my editor handed me an assignment to cover local legends in remote areas of New Mexico, I saw it as the perfect opportunity to combine work with a much-needed escape. Check out Bluewater Lake near Grants, he suggested. They say it's haunted. Could make for a compelling story. Haunted lakes weren't exactly my specialty, but the idea intrigued me. A quick online search revealed tales of a weeping woman who wandered the shores at night, searching for her lost child who drowned in a boating accident years ago. Locals whispered about hearing her cries echoing over the water, and some claimed to have seen her ghostly figure approaching their camps before vanishing into thin air. It sounded like the stuff of campfire stories, but I decided to see for myself. The drive from Albuquerque took me through stretches of desolate desert landscape before the terrain began to change, giving way to rolling hills and clusters of pine trees. By the time I reached Bluewater Lake State Park, the sun was beginning to dip low in the sky, casting a warm golden hue over the water. I found a secluded campsite not far from the shore. After pitching my tent and gathering some firewood, I sat down to watch the sunset. The lake was serene, the surface like glass reflecting the fiery colors of the sky. Hard to believe this tranquil place could be the setting for ghost stories. As darkness settled in, I built a small fire and prepared a simple meal. The stars emerged one by one, unblemished by city lights. A sprawling tapestry that reminded me just how small we are in the grand scheme of things. Around 10 p.m., I decided to turn in, climbing into my tent. I left the flap open to let in the cool night air. The rhythmic lapping of the water against the shore was soothing, and I felt myself drifting off almost immediately. A distant sound pulled me from sleep. I lay still, straining to hear. It was faint at first, a soft wail carried by the breeze. I sat up, my senses sharpening. There it was again, a mournful cry that sent a chill down my spine. Probably just the wind, I told myself, but doubt gnawed at me. Curiosity got the better of me. I slipped on my jacket and stepped out of the tent. The fire had died down to glowing embers, casting a dim light around the campsite. The night was eerily still. Then I heard it, a clear, unmistakable sobbing coming from the direction of the lake. I grabbed my flashlight and headed toward the sound. The beam cut through the darkness, illuminating the rocky shoreline and the rippling water beyond. "Hello," I called out. "Is someone there?" Silence. I waited, my heart pounding. Just as I was about to turn back, movement caught my eye. On the far side of a small cove, I saw her, a woman in a white dress, her long dark hair cascading over her shoulders. She was walking slowly along the water's edge, her head bowed. "Ma'am, are you all right?" I shouted. She didn't respond, didn't even look up. She just kept walking, her figure barely visible in the dim light. Concerned, I made my way around the cove, my footsteps crunching on the pebbles. As I got closer, I noticed that she was barefoot, her dress damp and clinging to her slender frame. "Excuse me," I called softly. "Do you need help?" She stopped and turned toward me. Even in the darkness, I could see her eyes, hollow and filled with indescribable sorrow. Her face was pale, almost translucent. A cold wave of realization washed over me. "You're her," I whispered. She lifted a hand, reaching out as if trying to touch me. Her lips moved, but no sound came out. Then, just as suddenly, she vanished. I stood there, stunned. My rational mind struggled to make sense of what I just witnessed. An illusion, I thought, a trick of the light. But deep down, I knew better. Back at camp, I tried to shake off the encounter. I poured myself a cup of coffee from the thermos, hoping it would steady my nerves. The wind had picked up, rustling the branches of the nearby trees. That's when I heard footsteps approaching from behind. I spun around, shining the flashlight into the darkness. "Who's there?" No answer. The footsteps grew closer, circling the campsite. I felt an icy chill in the air, unnatural for a summer night. "Show yourself," I demanded, trying to sound braver than I felt. A shadow moved just beyond the reach of the light, a fleeting glimpse of white fabric. I backed toward the tent, my heart racing. Suddenly, the sobbing returned, louder and more anguished. It seemed to come from all around me. I clapped my hands over my ears, but the sound penetrated, echoing inside my head. "Please, stop," I shouted. The crying ceased abruptly. I lowered my hands, the silence almost deafening. Then, a whisper, "Help me." I swallowed hard. "What do you want?" No response. Gathering my courage, I spoke again. "How can I help you?" The fire flared up suddenly, the flames turning a strange shade of blue. In the glow, I saw her standing across from me, her expression a mix of hope and despair. "Find him," she whispered. "Find who?" I asked. Before I could get an answer, the flames died down, and she was gone. Sleep was impossible after that. I sat by the fire until dawn, replaying the events in my mind. Who was she searching for? Her child? The one lost in the boating accident? Determined to uncover the truth, I drove into Grants the next morning to visit the local library. The librarian, an older woman with silver hair and kind eyes, greeted me warmly. "How can I help you?" she asked. "I'm researching local legends about Bluewater Lake," I explained, "particularly any stories about a woman who lost her child there." She nodded knowingly. "Ah, you must be talking about Elena." "Elena?" "Yes, it's a tragic tale from about 20 years ago. She and her young son, Michael, were out on the lake when their boat capsized during a sudden storm. They say she tried desperately to save him, but the currents were too strong. His body was never recovered." "That's awful," I said softly. Overcome with grief, Elena returned to the lake every night, calling out for him. One evening, she vanished. Some believe she walked into the water to join him. A chill ran through me. Do people really think her spirit haunts the lake? She gave a slight shrug. "Many have claimed to see her, hear her cries. Whether you believe it or not is up to you. Do you know where she's buried? There's a memorial for her and Michael at the old church cemetery just outside town." I visited the cemetery that afternoon. The sun was bright, but a sense of melancholy hung over the place. I found their gravestones side by side, adorned with weathered flowers and small trinkets, a toy car, a faded photograph. I stood there for a while, contemplating the depth of her sorrow. "Elena," I said aloud, "if you're still out there, I want to help you find peace." That night, I returned to the campsite. As darkness fell, I felt a strange calm wash over me. I lit a lantern and placed it near the shore, hoping it might serve as a beacon. "Elena," I called softly, "I know about you and Michael. I'm sorry for your loss." For a long time, there was nothing but the gentle sound of the water. Then, emerging from the mist that had settled over the lake, I saw her. She walked toward me, her steps slow and deliberate. "Did you find him?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. I don't know where he is," I admitted, "but maybe together we can help you let go." She looked past me, her eyes fixed on something unseen. "He's lost," she murmured. "I can't leave without him. Maybe he's moved on," I suggested gently. "Maybe he's at peace, and he wants you to find peace too." Tears welled in her eyes. "But I'm his mother. I should have saved him." "You did everything you could," I assured her. "It wasn't your fault." She closed her eyes, and for a moment, the weight of her grief was palpable. "Will you help me?" she asked. "Yes, I promised, but you need to let go." She opened her eyes and gave a small nod. "Thank you." As she began to fade, a faint smile touched her lips. The lantern flickered and went out. The next morning, the lake seemed different, brighter, more serene. I couldn't say for certain whether I truly communicated with a restless spirit or if it had all been a vivid dream brought on by an overactive imagination. But as I packed up to leave, I felt a sense of closure, as if a lingering sadness had been lifted from the place. Before driving away, I stopped by the ranger station to speak with one of the park employees. "Has anyone reported any unusual sightings at the lake recently?" I asked. The ranger, a middle-aged man with a sun-weathered face, looked at me curiously. "You mean Elena?" Yes. He smiled slightly. You know, it's funny you mention that. Used to get reports all the time, campers hearing cries, seeing a woman in white. But lately, it's been quiet. Maybe she finally found what she was looking for. I said, maybe, he agreed. Or maybe people just stopped paying attention. Back home, I wrote the article, careful to treat the story with the respect it deserved. I recounted the legend of Elena and Michael, the sightings, and my own experience, rather than sensationalize it. I focused on the themes of loss and the human need for closure. The piece was well received, sparking discussions about local history and the ways in which we cope with grief. A few weeks later, I received a letter postmarked from Grants. Inside was a handwritten note. Thank you for telling her story. She can rest now. There was no signature, but I had a feeling I knew who it was from, the librarian. Perhaps, or maybe someone else who understood. Sometimes, late at night, I think about Elena and wonder if she's finally found peace. I like to believe she has, that somewhere beyond our understanding, she and Michael are reunited. And if you ever find yourself camping by the shores of Bluewater Lake, listen closely. You might hear the gentle lapping of the water, the whisper of the wind through the trees, but no longer the mournful cries of a mother searching for her lost child. Because some spirits, once their stories are told and their pain acknowledged, can finally move on. Story number 3. Whispers from Carson Forest. I've always been drawn to the wilderness, a craving for solitude and a desire to disconnect from the incessant buzz of modern life. So when my old college buddy, Mark, suggested a camping trip to Carson National Forest in northern New Mexico, I didn't hesitate. The idea of spending a few days under the stars, surrounded by towering pines and crisp mountain air, was too tempting to pass up. Have you ever been to Carson? I asked as we packed up the SUV. Mark shook his head. No, but I've heard it's one of the most untouched forests in the country. Miles of trails, pristine lakes, and hardly any tourists. Perfect, I replied, stuffing my sleeping bag into the back. Exactly what I need. We set off early, the sun casting golden hues over the desert landscape before we ascended into the highlands. The transition was remarkable, the arid plains giving way to lush greenery as we climbed higher into the mountains. By late afternoon, we reached a secluded campsite far from any main roads or established trails. As we set up our tents, an older man emerged from the trees. He wore a worn flannel shirt and had a weathered face that spoke of years spent outdoors. Evening, he greeted us with a nod. Evening, Mark replied. Beautiful spot, isn't it? The man glanced around, his eyes lingering on the darkening forest. Aye, it's beautiful, but folks around here tend to avoid this area. Why's that? Asked, curious. He hesitated before speaking. Strange things happen on moonless nights, whispers in the dark, voices you can't quite understand. Best to keep your wits about you. Before we could ask more, he tipped his hat. Just passing through. You gentlemen have a safe night. With that, he disappeared back into the woods, leaving us exchanging puzzled glances. Friendly locals, Mark chuckled, trying to lighten the mood. Probably just trying to spook the tourists. I agreed, though a slight unease had settled in my stomach. We finished setting up camp, cooked dinner over the fire, and shared stories until the stars dotted the sky like a tapestry of diamonds. The forest was alive with the sounds of nocturnal creatures, a chorus of crickets, the distant hoot of an owl, the rustling of small animals in the underbrush. Around midnight, the moon dipped below the horizon, plunging the forest into inky darkness. I'm calling it a night, Mark said with a yawn, retreating to his tent. Yeah, me too, I replied, stoking the fire one last time before heading to my own tent. I lay there for a while, listening to the crackling of the dying fire and the gentle breeze rustling the leaves. Just as I was drifting off, I heard it, a faint whisper, so soft I thought I might have imagined it. I held my breath, straining to listen. There it was again, indistinct voices, speaking in a language I didn't recognize. It sounded like a conversation, but the words were fluid, almost musical, yet unsettling. I sat up and unzipped the tent flap, peering into the darkness. The fire had dwindled to glowing embers, casting eerie shadows that danced among the trees. "Mark!" I called softly. No response. I considered waking him, but decided against it. Probably just the wind, I told myself, but the whispers continued, growing slightly louder, though still elusive. They seemed to be coming from deep within the forest. Curiosity got the better of me. Grabbing my flashlight, I stepped out of the tent. The air was colder than before, and the forest felt different. Still alive, but with an undercurrent of something unseen. I shone the flashlight into the trees, the beam cutting through the darkness but revealing nothing out of the ordinary. "Hello!" I called out. Silence. The whispers faded, and I chuckled nervously. "You're letting that old man get into your head," I muttered, turning back toward the tent. Then, just as I was zipping up the flap, the whispers returned, this time louder and closer. It sounded as if multiple voices were surrounding the campsite, still speaking that strange, unknowable language. My heart pounded in my chest. I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. "Mark, wake up," I whispered urgently, shaking his tent. "What is it?" he mumbled sleepily. "Listen," I hissed. He sat up, rubbing his eyes. As we both remained silent, the whispers grew louder, more insistent. Mark's eyes widened. "What the hell is that?" he whispered. "I don't know. It started a few minutes ago." We both stood up, huddling near the remnants of the fire. The whispers were all around us now, circling like an unseen predator. The language was like nothing I'd ever heard, neither animal nor human. "Maybe it's other campers messing with us," Mark suggested, though he didn't sound convinced. I grabbed a fresh log and tossed it onto the embers. Flames leaped up, casting a wider circle of light. "Hello? Is someone out there?" Mark shouted into the darkness. The whispers paused for a moment before resuming, now more intense. It felt as though the forest itself was speaking. "Let's shine our lights into the trees," I suggested. We both grabbed our flashlights and aimed them into the surrounding woods. The beams flickered and dimmed, the batteries suddenly weakening. "That's odd," Mark muttered, tapping his flashlight. The whispers escalated, turning into hushed giggles and then to low murmurs that reverberated through the air. "Okay, this is seriously freaking me out," I admitted, my voice unsteady. "Maybe we should leave," Mark replied. "Agreed." We hurriedly began packing up our essentials, deciding to abandon the tents and retrieve them in the morning. As we stuffed items into our backpacks, a chilling realization struck me. The forest had gone completely silent. No crickets, no owls, nothing but the whispers. "Do you feel that?" Mark asked, his breath visible in the sudden cold. Before I could respond, a shadow moved at the edge of the firelight. Then another, and another, dark shapes flitting between the trees, too quick to focus on. "We're not alone," I whispered. "Time to go," Mark said firmly. We strapped on our packs and started down the trail that led back to where we parked. The path was narrow and uneven, roots and rocks jutting out to trip us in the dark. As we moved deeper into the forest, the whispers followed, matching our pace. The beams of our flashlights flickered weakly, offering little comfort. "How far do you think we are from the car?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. "About a mile," Mark replied. A mile felt like an eternity. Suddenly, the whispers ceased, replaced by an overwhelming silence. We stopped, listening intently. "Maybe they're gone," Mark whispered. A deafening roar shattered the silence, a cacophony of voices screaming in unison. It was a sound of pure anguish and fury, unlike anything I'd ever heard. "Run!" Mark shouted. We bolted down the trail, adrenaline fueling our steps. The forest seemed to close in around us, branches clawing at our clothes and faces. I glanced back and saw shadows pursuing us, amorphous figures that shifted and swirled like smoke. "Don't look back," Mark yelled. We burst into a clearing bathed in pale starlight. In the center stood an ancient stone structure, like an altar or monument, covered in strange symbols. "What is this place?" I gasped. "No idea. Just keep moving." But as we tried to pass through the clearing, an invisible barrier stopped us cold. It was like hitting a wall of solid air. "What's happening?" I cried out, pressing my hands against the unseen force. The whispers returned. Surrounding us, the shadows emerged from the tree line, forming a circle around the clearing. "We're trapped," Mark said, panic in his voice. The figures began to close in, their forms becoming more defined. They resembled people, but their features were blurred, faces obscured. One stepped forward, raising a hand as if in greeting or warning. "What do you want?" I shouted. The figure tilted its head, and the whispers coalesced into a single, chilling word spoken in perfect English. "Leave. We're trying," Mark replied desperately. The figure pointed toward the stone structure. Symbols on the monument began to glow with an eerie blue light. "Touch it," I urged. "Maybe it's a way out." "Are you insane?" Mark retorted. "Do you have a better idea?" With the shadows closing in, we had no choice. We approached the monument cautiously. As we drew nearer, the air grew colder, and the whispers intensified. I reached out and placed my hand on the glowing symbols. A jolt of energy surged through me, and the world spun violently. When I opened my eyes, we were standing beside our car at the edge of the forest. Dawn was breaking, the first rays of sunlight piercing the morning mist. "How did we get here?" Mark asked, his face pale. "I don't know," I replied, equally baffled. We didn't waste any time questioning our luck. We jumped into the car and sped away, the haunting whispers still echoing faintly in our minds. Back in the safety of our homes, we tried to rationalize what had happened. Maybe it was a shared hallucination brought on by exhaustion or some natural phenomenon. But then the nightmares began. Each night, I found myself back in that forest, surrounded by whispers and shadowy figures. The dreams grew more vivid, more terrifying. I could feel their presence, hear their voices calling to me in that unknown language. I reached out to Mark, only to find he was experiencing the same torment. "We need to find out what that monument was," he said during a late-night phone call. "Maybe it holds the key to ending this." Reluctantly, I agreed. We delved into research, scouring libraries and online forums for any information about Carson National Forest and its legends. That's when we stumbled upon an old Navajo legend about spirits trapped between worlds, beings who whispered in the darkness, luring the unwary into their realm. The legend spoke of a gateway marked by ancient symbols, a portal that could be opened or closed by those who knew how. "It fits," Mark said. "We must have stumbled upon their gateway. Then how do we close it?" I asked. "Perhaps we need to perform a ritual, offer something to appease them." Armed with newfound knowledge, we decided to return to the forest, a prospect that filled me with dread. Under the light of a full moon, we retraced our steps to the clearing. The forest was eerily quiet, as if holding its breath. The stone monument stood as before, the symbols now dull and lifeless. "We need to make an offering," Mark said, pulling a small pouch from his backpack. Inside were herbs, a carved wooden figure, and a piece of turquoise, a traditional Navajo offering. We arranged the items on the monument and recited the words we'd painstakingly translated from the old text. First, nothing happened. Then the ground trembled lightly, and the symbols began to glow once more. The whispers returned, but this time they were softer, less menacing. A figure appeared before us, not a shadow but the translucent image of an elder, his face lined with age and wisdom. "Thank you," he said in a voice that resonated within my mind. "For what?" I asked, awestruck. "For acknowledging us, for setting us free." The figures surrounding us began to fade, dissolving into the night air. The oppressive weight lifted, replaced by a serene calm. "Will the nightmares stop?" Mark asked. The elder nodded. "You have restored the balance. Go in peace." And just like that, he was gone. It's been years since that night. The nightmares ceased, and life gradually returned to normal. But the experience changed me. I no longer seek solitude in the wilderness, nor do I dismiss the old legends so readily. Some nights, when the world is quiet, I swear I can still hear faint whispers, reminders of the unseen forces that dwell just beyond our perception. If you ever find yourself in Carson National Forest, heed this warning. Respect the land and the spirits that inhabit it. For there are mysteries in this world that defy explanation, and some doors, once open, are not easily closed. Story number 4. The Skinwalker in the Navajo Forest. I've always been fascinated by the mysteries of the Southwest, the endless deserts, the rugged mountains, and the ancient cultures that have called this land home for millennia. As a photographer specializing in capturing remote landscapes, I've traveled to some of the most isolated places in America, but nothing prepared me for what I encountered in the Navajo forests of northern New Mexico. It all started when my friend Mike invited me on a week-long camping trip. He'd been commissioned to write an article about the lesser-known trails of the Navajo Nation, and he thought my photography would add depth to his piece. "You're going to love it, Jake," he promised over the phone. "These are places few outsiders have ever seen." I was intrigued. The opportunity to explore untouched wilderness and document it was too good to pass up. A week later, we set off in his dusty Jeep, leaving the comforts of modern life behind. The landscape transformed as we drove deeper into the reservation. Red rock formations gave way to dense forests of juniper and pine. The air was crisp, carrying the scent of sagebrush and distant rain. By late afternoon, we arrived at a small Navajo outpost. Mike had arranged to meet with a local guide named Tejo, who would lead us through the forest and ensure we respected the land and its traditions. Tejo was a quiet man in his 50s, with deep-set eyes that seemed to hold countless stories. He greeted us with a polite nod. "Thank you for helping us, Tejo," Mike said, extending his hand. Tejo shook it firmly. "Respect the land, and it will respect you," he replied. As we gathered our gear, an old woman approached us. She looked at us intently, then spoke to Tejo in Navajo. They exchanged a few words before she turned her gaze to me. "She says you should be cautious," Tejo translated. "The forest is old and holds many secrets." I smiled politely. "We'll be careful." She shook her head slowly. "Be more than careful," she warned in accented English. "There are things out there you don't understand." Her words lingered with me as we set off on foot. The sun dipping low in the sky, the first few hours were uneventful. I snapped photos of the breathtaking scenery, towering trees that seemed to touch the sky, shafts of golden light piercing through the canopy, and distant mountains shrouded in mist. As night fell, we set up camp in a small clearing. Tejo built a fire while Mike and I prepared dinner. "Strange encounter back there," I remarked, seasoning the stew. Mike shrugged. "The elders are full of legends and cautionary tales. It's part of their culture." Tejo glanced up from the fire. "She spoke of the Yenollushi," he said quietly. "What's that?" I asked. He hesitated before answering. "In our language, it means with it." He goes on all fours. "You might call it a skinwalker." A chill ran down my spine. I'd heard whispers of such things, shapeshifters, witches who could assume animal forms. Mike waved it off. "Just stories to keep children from wandering off at night." Tejo's expression remained serious. "Not just stories." An awkward silence settled over us. I decided to change the subject. "Well, the stew's ready." We ate in relative quiet, the crackling fire the only sound. The stars emerged one by one, filling the sky with a dazzling array of light. "I'm going to turn in," Mike announced after a while. "Big day tomorrow." He retreated to his tent, leaving Tejo and me by the fire. Do you believe in the Skinwalker? I found myself asking. Tejo gazed into the flames. Belief is a complicated thing. Out here, we respect what we don't understand. I nodded, unsure how to respond. Get some rest, he advised. We'll need our strength. I climbed into my tent, the canvas walls providing a thin barrier between me and the vast wilderness. Sleep came fitfully. Strange dreams plagued me, whispers in an unknown language, shadows moving just beyond my vision. A distant howl jolted me awake. I sat up, heart pounding, straining to listen. The night was eerily silent. Then it came again, a deep, guttural howl that resonated through the trees. It sounded like a wolf, but there was something off about it, too low, too human. I unzipped my tent and stepped out cautiously. The fire had dwindled to embers, casting a faint glow. Tejo was already awake, standing alert with his gaze fixed on the darkness. Did you hear that? I whispered. He nodded slowly. Stay close to the fire. Mike stumbled out of his tent, rubbing his eyes. What's going on? Before we could answer, another howl pierced the night, closer this time. Is that a wolf? Mike asked, concern creeping into his voice. Tejo's expression was grim. Not a wolf. A rustling sound came from the underbrush nearby. We all turned toward it, tense and silent. From the shadows emerged a massive figure at first glance. It appeared to be a large wolf, but as it stepped into the dim light, I saw that it stood unnaturally tall on hind legs. Its eyes glowed an eerie yellow, and its fur was matted and coarse. Jesus, Mike breathed. What is that? The creature snarled, revealing sharp teeth that gleamed in the firelight. But what froze me in place was its face. Amidst the lupin features were unmistakably human eyes, filled with a malevolent intelligence. Don't move, Tejo whispered. The creature circled us slowly, his gaze never leaving ours. My mind raced. This couldn't be real. Without warning, it let out a deafening howl and lunged toward us. Tejo threw a handful of powder from his pouch into the fire, causing it to roar to life with bright blue flames. The creature recoiled, snarling. Get back, Tejo commanded, positioning himself between us and the beast. Mike fumbled for his flashlight, his hands shaking. We need to get out of here. The creature began to circle again, its eyes reflecting anger and hunger. Follow me, Tejo ordered. We backed away slowly, keeping the fire between us and the creature. Tejo led us toward a narrow path, his movements deliberate. Don't run, he cautioned. It will provoke it. We moved cautiously, the creature stalking us from a distance. Its movements were unnervingly silent, despite its size. How is this happening? I whispered, my voice barely audible. Not now, Tejo replied firmly. After what felt like hours, we reached a rocky outcrop where the trees thinned. The creature stopped at the edge of the forest. Eyes locked onto us. Tejo turned to face it, chanting softly in Navajo. The creature snarled but did not advance. What's he doing? Mike asked. Praying, I think, I replied. The standoff continued until, finally, the creature emitted a low growl and retreated into the shadows. We didn't breathe a sigh of relief until the first light of dawn broke over the horizon. Back at the campsite, we hastily packed our belongings. We can't stay here, Mike said, his face pale. Tejo agreed. It's not safe. As we prepared to leave, the old woman from before appeared on the path. Her eyes held a mixture of sadness and admonishment. You were warned, she said softly. What was that thing? I demanded. How is any of this possible? She exchanged a glance with Tejo. There are things in this world beyond your understanding, she said. The Yenal Lushi walks these lands, a corrupted soul seeking what it has lost. Mike shook his head. This is insane. We need to alert someone, authorities. Scientists. No, Tejo interrupted sharply. Bringing outsiders will only make it worse. Then what are we supposed to do? I asked. Leave, the woman replied. And never speak of this place. The drive back was silent. Mike stared blankly out the window, while I replayed the night's events in my mind. Logic and reason failed me. Nothing could explain what we'd seen. "Do you think anyone would believe us?" Mike finally asked. I sighed. "I don't know, but maybe it's best if we keep this to ourselves." He nodded slowly. Agreed. Back home, life returned to a semblance of normalcy. But sleep was elusive. Nightmares of glowing eyes and haunting howls plagued me. I began researching Navajo legends, immersing myself in folklore and accounts of the supernatural. One evening, I received a package with no return address. Inside was a small woven talisman and a note. "Protection for your journey. Remember, respect the land." It wasn't signed, but I knew it was from Tejo. I kept the talisman with me, hoping it would ward off the lingering darkness that seemed to follow me. Weeks turned into months. Mike and I drifted apart. The shared trauma was too heavy a burden. One night, as I was developing photos from the trip, I noticed something unsettling. In one of the shots of the forest, taken before the encounter, a dark figure stood among the trees, a hulking form with glowing eyes. My hands trembled as I examined the photo. Had it been watching us all along? A sudden knock at the door made me jump. I wasn't expecting anyone. Peering through the peephole, I saw no one there. Cautiously, I opened the door. On the doorstep lay a single, coarse hair, too long and thick to be from any normal animal. Fear tightened its grip on me. Was I being hunted? I reached out to a professor of Native American Studies at the local university, Dr. Ellen Price. She listened intently as I recounted my experiences, her expression a mix of skepticism and concern. Skinwalkers are a deeply sacred and taboo subject among the Navajo, she explained. They're said to be witches who have committed unspeakable acts, gaining the ability to shapeshift. "How do I stop it from following me?" I asked desperately. She hesitated. Traditionally, confronting a skinwalker requires the help of a powerful shaman, but finding one willing to break the taboo and speak of it is nearly impossible. "Is there anything I can do?" She thought for a moment. "You might try a purification ritual. It could cleanse any negative energy attached to you." She provided me with instructions and a list of items needed. That night, I performed the ritual meticulously, every step offering a glimmer of hope. For a while, it seemed to work. The nightmares subsided, and I felt a sense of normalcy returning. But it was short-lived. One evening, as the sun set, I noticed a figure standing at the edge of the woods behind my house. My heart pounded as I recognized the familiar silhouette. This time, I refused to be a passive victim. Gripping the talisman Tejo had sent, I stepped outside. "What do you want?" I shouted, trying to keep my voice steady. The creature stepped forward, eyes glowing fiercely. It spoke in a raspy voice that sent chills down my spine. "You trespassed on sacred land." It hissed. "Now you carry the mark." I didn't know, pleaded. "I'm sorry. Sorry will not undo what has been done." Desperation took over. "Tell me how to make it right." The creature tilted its head, considering. "Return what was taken." "I didn't take anything," it growled. "The images, the moments you captured, they bind me. My photographs, the ones I had taken in the forest. I can destroy them," I offered. "Then do so," it demanded, "and speak of this to no one." I spent the night burning every photo, negative, and digital file from the trip. As the last image curled and blackened in the flames, a weight seemed to lift from the air. The following morning, I found another note at my door. "Balance is restored. Do not return." Years have passed since those events. I've respected the warning, never venturing near Navajo lands again. Mike moved away, and we lost touch completely. I've taken up urban photography. Skyscrapers and city streets hold no hidden terrors for me. But sometimes, late at night, I hear a distant howl echoing through the concrete canyons. It serves as a reminder of forces beyond my understanding. If you ever find yourself drawn to the mysteries of the wild, remember this: some places guard their secrets fiercely, and not all who seek them will return unscathed. Respect the land. Respect its guardians. Because once you've crossed into realms unknown, there may be no way back. Story number 5. The Ghosts of Gila Forest. I've always been fascinated by the remnants of the Old West, the ghost towns, abandoned mines, and the whispers of fortunes won and lost in the rugged landscapes of America. So when my brother Tom suggested a camping trip to Gila National Forest in New Mexico, I jumped at the chance. We'd heard stories about the area, tales of gold mines long deserted and the spirits that supposedly lingered there. But we were skeptics, adventurers seeking solitude and perhaps a glint of gold dust in forgotten streams. We set out in late October, the air crisp and the leaves turning shades of amber and crimson. The drive was long but scenic, winding through canyons and past rocky outcrops that seemed to touch the sky. As we entered the forest, the dense canopy of ponderosa pines and junipers enveloped us, casting dappled shadows on the dirt road. Perfect time of year, Tom remarked, adjusting his hat. No crowds, just us and nature. Maybe we'll strike it rich, I joked, tapping the gold pan we'd packed more for novelty than expectation. We found a suitable clearing near an old trail that, according to our map, led to several defunct mines. After setting up camp, we spent the afternoon hiking and exploring. The forest was eerily quiet. The only sounds the crunch of our boots on the underbrush and the distant cawing of ravens. As dusk settled, we made a fire and cooked dinner. The sky was a tapestry of stars. Unmarred by city lights, we sat in comfortable silence, sipping coffee and enjoying the crackling warmth of the fire. You know, Tom began, staring into the flames. They say this place is haunted by miners who died in cave-ins. I chuckled. You don't believe in ghosts, do you? He shrugged. Just stories, but it's interesting history. We turned in early, tired from the day's hike. My tent was cozy, and I quickly drifted into a deep sleep. A sharp, rhythmic sound pulled me from my slumber. Clink, clink, clink. It was faint but distinct, the unmistakable ring of metal on stone. I sat up, listening intently. The forest was otherwise silent. I glanced at my watch. 2:13 a.m. Tom, I called softly. No response. Curiosity piqued. I unzipped my tent and stepped into the chilly night air. The fire had died down to embers, casting a dim glow. The sound continued, slightly louder now. Clink, clink, clink. I walked over to Tom's tent and whispered, "Hey, you hear that?" He stirred and poked his head out. "Hear what?" "That sound, like someone mining." He listened, his brow furrowed. Probably just the wind or an animal. Before I could argue, the sound shifted to a muffled cry. A man's voice, desperate and strained. "Help! Is anyone there?" Tom's eyes widened. "You heard that, right?" "Yeah," I whispered. "It's coming from over there." We grabbed our flashlights and headed toward the direction of the voice. The beams cut through the darkness, illuminating the twisted shapes of trees and rocks. The cries grew more distant yet more urgent. "Help! Please!" We quickened our pace, stumbling over roots and stones. The terrain grew steeper as we approached the base of a rocky hill. At the foot was the dark maw of an old mine shaft, its wooden supports rotted and sagging. "Should we go in?" I asked, unease settling in my gut. Tom hesitated. "We can't just ignore someone calling for help, but it could be dangerous. The shaft might collapse." "Hello!" Tom shouted into the darkness. "Are you in there?" Silence. Then, faintly, "Please, help me." Against better judgment, we stepped inside. The air was thick with dust, and the walls glistened with moisture. We moved cautiously, our footsteps echoing. "Where are you?" Tom called. "Deeper." The voice replied, barely audible. We advanced, the passage narrowing. The beams from our flashlights danced over abandoned tools. A a rusted pickaxe, a broken lantern. A sudden rush of cold air swept past us, extinguishing Tom's flashlight. "Damn batteries," he muttered. "Mine's still working," I said, though my hands trembled. The tunnel opened into a small chamber. In the center stood a figure, his back to us. He wore tattered mining clothes, and his head hung low. Relief washed over me. "Sir, are you okay?" He didn't respond. "Sir." Tom stepped forward, reaching out. The figure turned slowly. His face was pale, eyes sunken and hollow. His lips moved, but the voice echoed from all around us. "You shouldn't be here." A chill shot through me. We heard you calling for help." He stared at us for a moment before fading away, dissolving into the darkness like mist. "What the hell?" Tom gasped. Before we could react, the walls began to tremble. Small rocks fell from the ceiling, and the wooden supports creaked ominously. "Run!" I shouted. We sprinted back the way we came, the tunnel collapsing behind us. Dust filled the air, choking and blinding us. We burst out into the night just as the entrance caved in completely, sealing the mine. Coughing and shaking, we collapsed on the ground. "What was that?" Tom wheezed. I couldn't answer. My mind raced, trying to rationalize what we'd seen. An illusion, a trick of the light, but deep down, I knew. Back at camp, we sat silently by the rekindled fire, its warmth doing little to dispel the cold that had settled in my bones. "We need to leave," I finally said. Tom nodded. "Agreed." We packed hurriedly, the forest seeming to watch us with unseen eyes. As we loaded the car, I glanced back and saw faint lights flickering among the trees, like lanterns swaying gently. "Do you see that?" I whispered. Tom followed my gaze. "Yeah, let's go." We drove in tense silence until the forest thinned and the highway stretched out before us. Only then did I feel like I could breathe again. Weeks passed, but the experience haunted me. Sleep was elusive, and when it came, it was filled with nightmares of collapsing tunnels and ghostly figures. One evening, Tom called. "I did some research," he said hesitantly, "about the mines in Gila Forest." "What did you find?" "Back in the late 1800s, there was a collapse. A group of miners was trapped inside. Rescue attempts failed, and they sealed the mine to prevent further accidents." I swallowed hard. "That must have been the mine we found." "There's more," he continued. "Locals say the spirits of those miners never left. They call out to the living, either seeking help or warning them away." "Do you think they were warning us?" Maybe we weren't supposed to disturb them." A heavy silence settled between us. "Look," Tom finally said, "I think we should go back." "What? Why?" "To make peace. Maybe leave a tribute or something." I was reluctant but agreed. Perhaps it would put an end to the nightmares. We returned to Gila Forest, this time during the day. The forest seemed less ominous under the sunlight, but an undercurrent of tension remained. At the collapsed mine entrance, we placed flowers and a small plaque inscribed with, "In memory of those who lost their lives. May you find peace." We stood in respectful silence. The air was still, the forest quiet. As we turned to leave, a soft breeze rustled through the trees. For a moment, I thought I heard a faint voice whisper, "Thank you." I looked at Tom, who nodded slowly. I heard it too. The nightmares ceased after that. Life returned to normal, but the experience left a lasting impression. I no longer scoffed at tales of spirits and hauntings. Some places carry the weight of history so profoundly that it seeps into the present. A year later, I received a letter from a historian in New Mexico who had heard about our tribute. He thanked us for acknowledging the forgotten miners and mentioned that others had since visited the site to pay their respects. Felt like a small redemption. Sometimes, when the night is quiet, I find myself thinking about Gila Forest, the towering pines, the starlit skies, and the echoes of pickaxes in the distance. If you ever find yourself wandering those ancient woods, listen carefully. You might hear the sounds of a bygone era, the whispers of souls who linger, tied to the land by tragedy. Respect their stories, honor their memories, and tread lightly, because some echoes from the past are more than just memories. They are reminders that the line between the living and the dead is thinner than we think. Thank you for joining us on this spine-chilling journey through New Mexico's haunted forests and swamps. From the ghostly miners of Gila to the eerie lights of Lincoln Forest, these tales remind us that even in the desert stillness, the unknown is always near. If you enjoyed these stories, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell so you never miss another dive into the unknown. Until next time, stay safe, and remember, some calls in the night are best left unanswered.